So let's select a volume to take off the shelf here. How about we go for Hamlet, King John, and Titus Andronicus in this red cloth. And you'll notice they're not in perfect condition. They were read by my grandfather. They were read by the owner before that, and they spent some time in my grandparents' basement. But we've got this book plate here. C. Zingerlein would be my grandfather. Etta O. Martin, I don't know for sure, but I do believe that would be a relative on my grandfather's side, because there are some Martins, but then again, it could just be a completely random Martin because Martin is an extremely, extremely common last name. But it's a nice little set published by A.L. Burt in New York around the turn of the century, the beginning of the 20th century. And they're all just like this, with very readable font, very comfortable to hold. The pages are yellowing as you would expect. I once tried to do a little online research, but couldn't really find much about the publisher or these editions. They are presumably just one set of many, many editions and sets of Shakespeare that were published in the early 20th century. But next to that, we have some books about books. On the end here are two novels by Christopher Morley, and both of these are about bookshop owners. So Parnassus on Wheels is the first book, and The Haunted Bookshop is a sequel. So Parnassus on Wheels is a reprint. It's got illustrations by Douglas Gorslein in here. We'll bring this down, open it up, take a look at it. So it's originally from 1917, and it's just this delightfully hilarious story about a woman living on a farm with her brother who decides on a impulsive whim to purchase a traveling book cart when the owner of it comes by and lets it be known that he is looking to sell his business and retire. And so she does. She buys the book cart and his stock and takes off from the farm with her brother hot on her trail, thinking how could she, his own sister, do such a thing. And it's a great story. But the sequel to that is The Haunted Bookshop, published a few years later. This one's got some water damage and whatnot, but this is not a more recent reprint. This is, it's not a first edition, but it is from 1919. It was first published in 1918. But it is about the same characters from Parnassus on Wheels who have now settled down and set up their bookshop in Brooklyn in New York City. And the bookshop may or may not be haunted. It may or may not have some mysterious, politically charged events embroiled within its walls. And so that's a great one. Next to that, not quite of the same speed, but we have a couple of books by Leighton Strachey, Eminent Victorians, which is a Folio Society reprint, and I'm just realizing these shelves need a little bit of dusting. Eminent Victorians, which is a Folio Society reprint, And I'm not going to take that out of its box because I'd have to set down the phone to do that because it's very tightly wedged in there. But that is a series of short biographies on who he felt were eminent people of the Victorian age. And Characters and Commentaries is also another collection of short biographical pieces. We will open up this one. It's got some paint stains on it. So there is Strachey looking back at us. And this one is from 1933. And we have essays on English letter writers, early essayists, later essayists. Everyone from Shakespeare to Voltaire, to Pope, Addison, Steele, and Swift, and Lord Chesterton. So that's a nice collection. Next to that, we have a book that sent me on a wild goose chase. The third attempt was the charm. The first time I attempted to order The Intimate Thoughts of John Baxter Bookseller, edited by Augustus Murr, and Augustus Murr is actually the author, not the editor at all. The first time I attempted to order this book, the seller could not find it in their stock. The second time I attempted to order this book, it vanished in the mail. It completely vanished in the mail. And the third time, for, I might add, a pretty penny, it finally arrived, but I absolutely wanted to read it. And it was kind of fun that I got at least a partially intact dust jacket with it. It's too bad that someone decided to repair the dust jacket with tape. But there is at least a partially intact dust jacket. We're missing part of the spine. It's chipped on the top. And it's pretty much split on the sides, but it's mostly intact. So I ended up paying $60 from an American bookseller for this book. And you don't even want to know what the shipping was. You would think the shipping would be less for such a small book. It was not. But I will have to say it was totally worth it because I greatly enjoyed reading this. It is it's purported to be the diary of a bookseller that's been edited, published in 1942 in Great Britain. But it is in fact a novel. It's not a diary at all. And it's very similar in nature to one of the books we looked at the other day. Let me just see where it is down here. The Bankrupt Bookseller, which also purported to be the found papers of a deceased bookseller that had been put in order. Now, The Intimate Thoughts of John Baxter Bookseller has a much happier ending. Our bookseller does not die at the end. Our bookseller survives, which is not a spoiler about the Bankrupt Bookseller because we are told right from the start in the Bankrupt Bookseller that the bookseller is deceased. Next to that, we have Confessions of a Book Lover by Maurice Francis Egan. We still have the paper label on the spine, although it's in pretty battered condition. This one was very cheap, $4.95. This is from 1922, and it's a collection of essays on reading and book collecting. There's some great topics covered in here. You know, poetry, novelists, biography and memoir, yeah, that's fine. But my boyhood reading, That was my favorite in here. I absolutely love when essayists and writers dive into their early influences and their early experiences with books. So next to that, we have For the Love of Books by Jordan Smith. And let me just get this open here. So this is from 1934. It is not a first edition, but it is a great book, and this is a great copy of the book. Great in the sense that the paper is really nice. The paper feels really nice. The font is really nice. And so he talks about collecting interests, collecting American authors, collecting English authors, how to pick and choose books, all sorts of fun subjects, collector's trifles, some of those fun collecting adventures. Basically, if you're a fan of essays on collecting and collecting stories, that is a fun one. Next to this is Morocco Bound, Adrift Among Books by Edwin Valentine Mitchell. Red cloth. It's a nice frontispiece. Published in 1929. The maneuvers of bookselling are now equal in number to the stratagems of war. And once again, essays on books. The Christmas Battle for Books is a fun one. This is a humorous collection about the author's experiences working in a bookshop and interacting with customers. Book thieves and author snatching, buying books abroad. And there are some fun illustrations in this one as well. Next to that, we have Powell's A Passion for Books, which is very pretty indeed. I don't know how well it's picking up, but there's actually a little bit of gold glitter in the paper that's been used for the boards of this book. And so we have here, this special edition of A Passion for Books is limited to 975 copies for private distribution to friends of the publisher in Christmas of 1958. And Lawrence Clark Powell wrote a number of books on book collecting and reading. Book thievery, the love of books, the power to evoke the power of books. Lots of great stuff in there as well. And next to that is one by the same author, titled Books in My Baggage. And this one still has the dust jacket in very nice condition here. From 1960. More essays on the topic of books. Although I think I actually enjoyed A Passion for Books more than I did Books in My Baggage. Then on the end here we have a couple of, I guess I would say, niche collecting periodicals. So here we have the Colophon, a quarterly for bookmen from spring 1938. And so this was a periodical that was published 4 times a year on the topics of book collecting, books specific interests of collectors. Beautifully printed, very interesting. It's certainly something that, I would want to buy and read more of if they were more widely available in good condition for a reasonable price. They're interesting, but I'm really not willing to pay more than, I would say, $20 or $30 per copy. And I would want it to be in nice condition like this. So that does kind of limit me. But next to that is a book from 1925 titled Private Book Collectors. And if we open it up, got to be careful because the board is kind of loose. There is an opening essay on the so-called modern tendencies in book collecting by George H. Sargent. But basically, what it is a directory of book collectors in the United States and Canada with a list of their collecting interests from 1925. And I'm assuming you would have had to register, perhaps with your local society, to make this list. But I can see how it would be quite a useful resource for a bookseller back in the day. If they had a particular copy of something they wanted to sell, they could open up this directory and say, oh, I don't know, Robert Smith of Massachusetts or whatever collects in this field. I wonder if he'd like to purchase this copy of the book. Oh, look, there's his address. Maybe I'll write him and see if he'd like to buy it. Certainly not something that we would need today, but perhaps very useful in its day. And next to that is the Annual of Bookmaking from 1938. It's associated with the colophon, which is that work that we just looked at a couple of moments ago. We have this lovely book plate here and this slip of paper describing exactly what the book we're looking at is. It says, profusely illustrated, foreword by J.T. Winterich, includes binding design by W.A. Diggins and title page design by Rockwell Kent. Typographical sketches of 25 American presses, rubbed at corners, else fine. And I would say rubbed at corners, but we're straight up missing the corner of that page. But it is a very interesting book on bookmaking, and although my collecting interests aren't covered here, if, for instance, you were someone who, let's see if we can find something. If you were someone who wanted to collect Wolf-made volumes, then you would have some information on them here. If you were interested in the Riverside Press, then you would have the section in this book on the Riverside Press to refer to help you in your collecting. And resources like this were indispensable in the days before the internet. People really had to rely on books to find out anything about anything they wanted to collect. Otherwise, you had to rely on a bookseller or on other collectors and kind of, word of mouth. But that is an interesting little thing there. And we will go up a shelf again to more books on books. I've got two works by Rosenbach on the end here. A Book Hunter's Holiday, being one of his memoir works on book collecting. Oh, Hippo Books Blacklist. That is a note to me, because I'm remembering now that I had a bad bookseller experience in 2020 when I bought this from Hippo Books. They sent it by some sort of strange courier service that ended up utilizing Canada Post's collect on delivery service. Now, collect on delivery is a very distinct service. It's not custom fees. And so when it arrived, I got a notice from the post office, I think requesting 10 or 15 additional dollars before they would release it to me. And when I contacted the bookseller, Hippo Books, sort of saying, what's happened here? Something weird is going on. I've paid for shipping through Abe. I've paid for the book. I didn't authorize additional shipping fees. I didn't authorize for you to send this by collect on delivery. They didn't refund me that extra $10 or $15 I had to pay. They basically told me, you're responsible for import fees and customs duties. And they weren't listening to me when I told them it's not customs duties. I did not have to pay customs on this book. What they had done was something that is actually quite illegal. They had sent the book by collect on delivery, and I had not authorized them to send it by collect on delivery. But I let it go, and I kept the book, and I was a little bit pissed off, and that was my reminder not to order from Hippo Books again. And that happened to me twice in those early months of the pandemic, where I think, shipping was a little bit off, and there was some sort of service out of the States that was offering shipping using this weird, sketchy workaround where they would offer to have it put through customs, like it was like an express through customs, but they would charge the customer on the other end. And I was really confused because I didn't request express through customs. I was willing to wait as long as it would take, as I would for any other book. And they did something sketchy. Hippo Books did something sketchy, refused to remedy it. And there was another bookseller that had the same thing happen. And when they realized that the shipper they had used had resulted in additional charges for me that I hadn't authorized, and that had nothing to do with normal customs fees. It had to do with fees from the courier service they'd used. They refunded me. The other seller did. This seller, Hippo Books, did not, and so Hippo Books is on my blacklist. And I have a very short sort of blacklist, no-buy list of booksellers. It's really only, I would say, 3 or 4 sellers I've encountered. Weirdly enough, 2 of them encountered just in the last couple of weeks here. But I've always been hesitant to sort of share that list too broadly. I'll make a video and I'll complain about the bookseller, but I don't want to bash a bookseller too harshly. Although, to be honest, till this day, I'm still pissed off about this one because it was their complete lack of understanding and actually doing something that I'm fairly certain is illegal, because you cannot just, send something to somebody with additional charges attached. And I would have been well within my rights, certainly under Canadian law, under the rules of Canada Post, to not accept the package. The person at the counter at Canada Post actually questioned the package and asked me, "Do you know what this is? Did you authorize this?" But I would have been well within my rights not to accept the book, but I really, really wanted the book. And so, yeah, some sketchy behavior on the part of Hippo Books in those early days of the pandemic. And, in retrospect, I think they just misunderstood. I'll give them the credit of saying that they misunderstood what they had done. Because, yeah, there would have been no reason for me to pay any sort of import fees on a book that I was paying $15 for. It just doesn't make any sense. I don't pay tariffs or import fees on used books unless I think they'd have to be they'd have to be worth more than like $500 or something for me to be paying any sort of import taxes or fees when something comes into Canada. And I think I've rambled on long enough about that. But so that's A Book Hunter's Holiday by Rosenbach. And the other work here is The Unpublishable Memoirs, also by Rosenbach. This one is labeled as memoir, but it's more a piece of fiction, or at least you would hope it would be. It's this character who has a case of kleptomania, but he's only stealing the things, the books and pieces of art that he most desires for his own collection, these books and prints and whatnot. And he has this grand idea that he's going to open his own museum one day. And he's got these unethical, conniving ways of coming into possession of the things that he wants. Next to that are two collections of essays by James Milne, The Memoirs of a Bookman and The London Book Window. We'll pull them both off together and bring them down to the floor here. So The Memoirs of a Bookman in green cloth. We've got a little bit of damage there, but this is a first edition from 1934. Essays on Ruskin and a number of authors, George Eliot, Tennyson, lots of good stuff. This is less about book collecting and more about the books and the authors themselves, whereas A London Book Window is a little bit more about his own collecting experiences, but also very heavily based on the authors that he collected. And that one is from 1925. Next to this are two books by Orcutt, both published by Little Brown and Company. One is The Kingdom of Books and the other is The Quest for the Perfect Book. And both of these are for the lover of the physical book and for those who are interested in bindings and printers and whatnot. This one's got a beautiful book plate there. All the images have tissue guards in these two volumes. In Quest of the Perfect Book, Reminiscences and Reflections of a Bookman, 1926, and this is the first impression of the trade edition. And so he begins with, Gutenberg, Aldus Manutius, and a few of the well-known, notable early bookbinders. Then he talks about type and illumination, and there's pages and pages of wonderful illustrations and reproductions and whatnot, photographs, facsimile, pretty much anything you'd want to see a beautiful illustration of. This one may look better on the outside, but this one I actually prefer. Unfortunately, the bookmark in this one, the ribbon bookmark, has rotted away and is no longer attached. But this one is also about bookbinding. (1927). This one is copy 267 of 475 copies of the limited edition. And as you can see, it appears to be signed by William Dana Orcutt. Books in the Cradle, talking about early books, incunables, bookbinding, typography. They're on the same subject, these two books, but they cover it in a different way. They're sort of companion books to each other almost. Both very interesting. This one especially, I was absolutely immersed in for hours and hours when it first arrived. And next to the Orcut is another one titled On the Margins of Old Books by Lemaitre. Bringing this down here. And I've left some sticky notes in here. This one is from 1929. And it's once again essays on books, but on particular books. So he talks about the Iliad, the Odyssey, the Aeneid, the Gospels. It's more commentary and literary essay than collecting. And we do have a little bit of a hole here because this one was the victim of a bookworm at some point. Next to that is Dean Farrar's collection titled Men I Have Known, which is a collection of essays about authors. We've got a Christmas 1897 inscription to either, I think, to Aunt Sophia with something in love. I can't tell whether it's to Eliza or whether it's to Aunt Sophia, but Aunt Sophia is involved in there somehow. But it is just this great collection of essays on everyone from Tennyson to Matthew Arnold, all the way down to talking about Waldo Emerson and Oliver Wendell Holmes and a number of authors, bishops and cardinals who I was not familiar with at all, really. But it's a nice, interesting work there. Not one of my favorites, but it's solid writing. Next to that, we have The Portrait of a Scholar by Chapman. This is from 1922. It's the second impression, and it is a collection of essays written between 1916 and 1918. And my favorite one in here is the essay on reading aloud, the pleasures and the purpose of reading aloud. Wonderful collection of essays. Then we have Hours with Men and Books by, trying to remember Matthews' first name, William Matthews. And this one is actually published in Toronto, but I still think I ordered it from the States, so it's crossed the border at least twice. But once again, just a collection of essays on literary figures, everyone from Thomas de Quincey down to more general topics, writing for the press, a day at Oxford, book buying. Some of them are anecdotal, and some of them are more, I guess I would say, academic sounding. I would say the writing style of Hours with Men and Books is a little bit clunky, and I probably wouldn't recommend it unless you're willing to take the time to unpack his winding, twisting sentences. Next to this is a book by Augustine Birrell titled Essays of Today and Yesterday. And as you can see, it's beautifully bound. I love this border here with the leaves. And as you would guess, it's a collection of essays. And I've got to resituate myself here because it doesn't seem to matter how I sit. My foot and my leg are going to sleep in some way, shape, or form. So this one's 1926. And my favorite one in here was the first one, On the Habit of Reading. The other ones were kind of so-so. You'll find that with a lot of these old essay collections. Sometimes there'll be one essay that you absolutely love, and the other are just incredibly mediocre or not interesting because they're not within your reading or collecting interests. So moving back up here, we have another collection titled Pages Assembled by Wedmore. And I hope I'm not making anyone dizzy going up and down with the camera from the shelf here. But these are a selection from the writings imaginative and critical of Frederick Wedmore. And I remember particularly the section in here on Coleridge and Wordsworth and on Balzac as well. I don't remember enjoying all that much the other pieces. Perhaps the Rembrandt I enjoyed. I think I would have bought this around the same time I saw the Rembrandt exhibit at the National Gallery here in Ottawa. But that's a nice little slim volume that's worth reading if you ever come across it. And next to this is Ventures in Book Collecting. This one, not much to look at. There once upon a time probably would have been a very nice dust jacket. Now we just have discolored boards. But this one is from 1923. There you see William Harris Arnold's portrait there. And it is a collection of essays and anecdotes on book collecting. The making of a book collector, how a book collector becomes a book collector, the luck of book collecting, and so on and so forth. The first half of the book is more interesting. The second half is all right, if you're interested in Stevenson and Tennyson and a few others. Victorian books and letters, I recall that being quite interesting. I think this one actually led to a bit of a list for buying. Certainly the section on Charles Dickens piqued my interest when I read it. Once again, some very nice illustrations here. Just an interesting book overall, definitely a fascinating one for those who like to dig into 20th century book collecting. Next to this is Beautiful Books by Cyril Davenport. And next to that is Byways Among English Books, also by Cyril Davenport. So we'll pull those two down together. Open this one up first. That lovely tipped in plate there. It's got 16 illustrations, 2 plates in color and 1 in monotone. And this is from 1929, and it is all about manuscripts and bindings and illumination and the printed book. And you'll see my bookmark is in here because I don't think I ever actually read through chapter 2, which is on the printed book. I think I set that aside and I should finish that at some point. But I did read through Byways Among English Books, which still has the dust jacket intact here. Got 61 drawings by the author and 16 other illustrations. And so we've got the table of contents here. This is from 1927. Collectors and collecting printed and engraved books, bindings in leather, gold, silver, velvet, silk, satin, canvas, and cloth. Section on illustrated books, a section on miniature books. Miniature books are kind of fascinating. Not at all my collecting interest, since you can't exactly you cannot exactly sit down and read miniature books unless you've got a magnifying glass on hand. But I know there's many people who find miniature books fascinating, and that's their chief collecting interest. But I think that's more about aesthetics than about buying books that interest you in terms of their contents. So I'll put those back up here. Goodness gracious. So we're almost at the end of the shelf here, which is good because I've got a horrible cramp in my foot. But Fishers of Books by Barton Curry. Another tale of book collecting adventures. And that's not looking good. I think that's always looked that way, but less good than it used to. Bring that down here. The Bibliomaniac's Wife. The house is burning down, and instead of saving his wife, he's having her throw all the books out that window where the flames are just absolutely lapping at both her and the books. Great work, dear. Just the Johnson Dictionary now. The Brontes, the Austens, and the Trollops. The fire brigade should arrive presently. And this is from 1931. The Beginning Urge, How Collectors Happen. The Seductions of Happy-Go-Lucky Collectors. And this is one of my favorites, absolute favorites on book collecting. These humorous, fun, informative essays. Next to that is Holbrook Jackson's The Anatomy of Bibliomania. This is a reprint from the 1970s, but it is just absolutely chocked full with everything you can think of on different book topics, everything from books in general, the pleasures of books, the art of reading. And this was originally published in 1950, but as I said, this is a 1978 reprint. But what Jackson has essentially done is compiled all these interesting facts and quotes about bookish topics into one delightful book. This is not something you sit down and read end to end all in one go. It's something you dip into every now and then. You might think, I think I might like to read on the might of words tonight. And then you'd go and you'd open that up and read a little bit. But that's a great one. And we've got one more on the shelf here. This is Book Collecting by J.H. Slater. And I really like the gold on the front board of this one. But this one is apparently number 344 of 500 copies in this large paper edition from 1892. And it's titled, more correctly, Book Collecting, A Guide for Amateurs. And so it is offering some advice and information on everything from early printed American books to the topics of bookworms. There's a great selection in here on bookworms and how to care for your books and early English presses. And there's some great reproductions of printers' devices in here. So that's quite a nice one, and one I'd recommend if you come across it. But I am going to get up off the floor. Thankfully, I think we can move up there next time, and I can give my poor half-asleep feet a rest from being sat upon because I'm crammed in this little space here between the shelves and the bed, and there's not really any way to reasonably sit here without sitting upon my feet. But, so we've made it through 3 layers of this shelf. We have the top of that one, and then we'll move on to the J.M. Barrie some more books on book collecting, including the A. Edward Newton, some of my grandfather's books, some books from Graphic Publishers Press, some L.M. Montgomery, and that'll pretty much be it, because down there is just a collection of the journals I've kept throughout my life. But when we do finish that, we will make our way to the corner shelf, which has an interesting assortment of children's books and Folio Society. And then we will turn around and we will go to the other two large shelves, large like those two on the end there, the other two large shelves, and look at those ones.